Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to the Newark Public Library. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome editor Whitney Strub and contributors Aaron Frazier, Dominique Rocker, Peter Savastano, and Christina Strasburger of the Queer Newark Oral History Project for a discussion of Queer Newark, stories of resistance, love, and community. In conversation tonight, you'll hear our guests expand upon a deeply personal history in which working class people of color are the central actors, and in which violence, poverty, and homophobia could never suppress joy, resistance, love, and desire. My name is Candace. I'm the LGBTQ liaison librarian here at the Newark Public Library, and I manage the NPL LGBTQ+ Resource Center, including its programming, reference services, and ever-growing collection of print and digital materials dedicated to amplifying LGBTQ+ voices and celebrating the diversity of the human experience. I'm proud to report that Queer Newark has graced our shelves as the newest edition, and it will be available for sale right here with these lovely folks here and for checkout with your library card as well. On behalf of our director, Christian Zabriskie, and the Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, I thank you all for joining us this evening and hope that you enjoy. Thank you.
Good evening. It's so lovely to see all your faces. I am Christina Strasburger, the co-founder of the Queer Newark Oral History Project and administrator for History and Africana Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. And it is my pleasure to also extend a very warm welcome on behalf of our team. A few quick housekeeping rules. We are live streaming to Facebook as well. So hello to everyone watching on Zoom. If you have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to drop them in chat and we will respond. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Queer Newark, we are a community university partnership founded in the summer of 2011 by writer-activist Darnell Moore and our very own historian Burl Satter and me. After a series of discussions with activists, artists, church leaders, students, faculty, and staff made evident that there was a gap in the historical record and critical need for the preservation and cross-generational sharing of local queer history and knowledge. Since inception, our primary goal has been to ensure the stories of LGBTQ+ people here in the great city of Newark were recorded, preserved, and made accessible to academic and community-based researchers, students, and any and everyone who wishes to learn more about the rich history of our community. The themes explored in these interviews include police violence, gentrification, HIV/AIDS, harassment, finding family, and the complexity and scope of gay relationships. Our programming bridges the community and campus, and we believe it's central to our mission to introduce people to the kind of methodologies we're using in our project. And now, with great thanks to our co-director and book editor, Whitney Strub, we have a book. Feel free to clap. I mean, this is worthy. A lot of late nights there. So before I turn the floor over to our amazing panelists, I just want to express our immense thanks to those who have contributed their voices, time, talent to make Queer Newark. First, we acknowledge and give thanks to all of our incredible narrators, the heart of the project. While we remain grateful for the voices preserved in our archive, we're also painfully aware that there are many we will never get to hear. So we're grateful for the support of our amazing community partners for their collaboration over the years, including, of course, Newark Public Library, the Newark LGBTQ Community Center, Gallery of Faro, who just closed their doors recently and we will miss tremendously, Newark Pride, the African American Office of Gay Concerns, as well as the support of the Rutgers Newark Chancellor, Nancy Cantor, and her office, who provided us with a seed grant in 2014 to help us build the infrastructure that made our project what it is. So the School of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office and our colleagues at Dana Library and the Federated Department of History, we see a few of you, thank you so much. And finally, a shout out to the team. whose dedication and passion for the work brought us here and continues to move us forward. Fearless co-directors, Timothy Stewart Winter, who I think is on Zoom, and Whitney Strub, who you'll hear more from shortly, our fabulous public historian and advisor, Mary Rizzo, our longest graduate researcher, podcast developer, and soon-to-be PhD, Kristen Scorsone, and the many incredible graduate student researchers, some of which are here. Shout out to Esperanza. Dominique, you're going to hear from later, but yes. Yeah, you can clap for them too. There'll be plenty of time. And of course, our undergraduate student researchers and community volunteers. We are proud of the work that we have done and the work we will continue to do to ensure that LGBTQ history is remembered within the larger context of Newark history. In this climate, it is imperative for the LGBTQIA+ people, our young people especially, to feel seen and empowered by history. So we strive to ensure that they have access. Visit our online archive, queer.newark.rutgers.edu. But we also want to ensure that they have access to the book, Queer Newark Stories of Resistance, Love, and Community. So I'm going to step off, but before I do, if you have access to any school libraries and want to make sure the Queer Newark book is on the shelves, please come chat with us, and we will make sure we have a book donated to your school's library. With that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the support, and we can't wait to hear from you. Let me get down.
Good evening. I'm Aaron Frazier, one of the contributors. I am not dead yet. I am not perfect, but I am at ease. Disabled and trying to get back stable, only to be knocked back down. Poverty, not a choice I would make, but poor I am, hard to survive in this land. New policies day to day, setbacks, drawbacks, but here I am, still stepped on, played on, just forgot about. I still survive. I am not dead yet. As you continue to kill me quietly day to day, I am not dead yet. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, welcome. So this is the panel. We have with us now, we have the editor of the book, Whitney Strub, at the end, and three of the contributors. My name is Tom Ankner. I'm the supervising librarian in charge of the New Jersey room here, the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center. I'll be moderating this little discussion we have. And I'm just, first of all, going to introduce the contributors here, the panelists. Whitney Strub, on the end there, is an associate professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rutgers University, Newark. His first book, Perversion for Profit, The Politics of Pornography and the Rise of the New Right, was published by Columbia University Press in 2010. His second book, Obscenity Rules, Roth versus United States and the Long Struggle Over Sexual Expression, was published in 2013 by the University Press of Kansas. His articles on obscenity, pornography, and sexual politics have appeared in American Quarterly, Radical History Review, Journal of the History of Sexuality, Journal of Women's History, The Lawn, and Temple of Schlock. I love that title. He blogs about films shot in Newark and sexual politics. Dominique Rocker, who's next to him, is a poet, writer, and master's student in the history department at Rutgers University, Newark. Dominique earned a BA in print journalism from California State University, Fullerton in 2013, and an MA in African American Studies from UCLA in 2020. Her previous research looked at the activism and resistance strategies of Black women in the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, California, and New Haven, Connecticut. This work focused on both narrative and erotic resistance via oral testimony and written poetry. In thinking about pleasure as a site of resistance for Black women, particularly as Black women also must negotiate a sexuality enmeshed with pain and trauma, Dominique's interests have shifted to questions about Black women in pornography in the digital age and the potential for centering queer pleasure as radical resistance. Aaron Frazier is a poet and writer. He self-published 2 works and writes for La Reine magazine and several other local and national publications. He holds a BS in Urban Studies Policy from St. Peter's College in Jersey City and an associate's in Liberal Arts Social Sciences from Essex County College. He is a community activist, the mother of the House of Divine of Greater Newark, a volunteer for the Newark LGBTQ Community Center, a previous coordinator of Project Fire 2 of El Club del Barrio, and an active member of Hyacinth Cab and Thrive Role Models Story. And Peter Savastano, sitting next to me, was born and raised in Newark, where he lived and worked for most of his adult life. He holds a PhD in religion and society from Drew University. An anthropologist of religion, consciousness, sexuality, and gender, Dr. Savastano is academically and personally interested in the role that religion and/or spirituality plays both for better and for worse in the formation of queer identity, subjectivity, and practice. He is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Seton Hall University. And to everyone. So I wanted to start asking, first of all, a few questions about each of the contributors' chapters. And then I'm going to ask some general questions about the book. And then I want to ask some questions about queer life in Newark in general. And then I'm going to open it up to the audience. People can ask questions at the end. First of all, Whit, I want to begin with you. In your essay, you write about how LGBTQ people were not welcome in leftist activist circles, at least not if they wanted to live openly as their authentic queer selves. Can you talk a little bit more about why that was? And was this phenomenon more prevalent in Newark than in other places?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me and all of us here. It's really an honor to be at NPL, a place I deeply love. So yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming out. Yeah, you know, I mean, my chapter is about the queer Newark left and in the new left and Black Power eras, roughly the 1960s into the 1980s. And it all began actually with an archival collection here at NPL, the Newark Coalition for People with AIDS. And they had an obituary in the collection, just a printed obituary with a handwritten notation. And it was for Raymond Proctor, who had been head of CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, in the 1960s in Newark, and died from AIDS in the late 1980s. And the annotation on his obituary just said, in lieu of donations or flowers, please send money to the People with AIDS Coalition. And the actual obituary didn't list a cause of death. And it really struck me because, I mean, here was somebody who there was absolutely no documentary evidence linking Raymond Proctor to LGBTQ history except for this obituary, which, of course, dying from AIDS in the 80s did not, obviously mean that one was gay, but it certainly, statistically speaking, raised some questions. And I looked into his life and wound up tracking down his family and interviewing his nieces and nephews. And, it turns out he was gay and he was quite out and proud. And that was a history that was just lost, without oral history and without the family's collective memory. And, as somebody who's definitely on the left and interested in the left, it became a kind of analytical question for me. How did queer leftists navigate a world where, the conventional forces of oppression for queer history are so often the church and the government and things like that. But in leftist history specifically, there was also this, somewhat less vicious homophobia a lot of the time because, the Communist Party USA just didn't have the punitive power of the US government. But it was nonetheless a struggle for queer leftists. And it became clear once you started digging, there was a really interesting story here in Newark that just hadn't been told. That went through the white new left into the Black Power era and the really complicated, sexual politics of Amiri Baraka's era. And so anyway, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on and on about it, but that's kind of where it began. And that's the impetus for that chapter, which, to my mind does speak to kind of ongoing questions about, for instance, the need for the left to be trans inclusive and trans positive. You'll hear some people on the left say that, well, we care about material issues, not cultural issues, as if, bathroom access and job access and education access are not material. And so that's what I'm hoping to contribute to in my chapter, is that ongoing discussion, bringing queer liberation and the left further together.
Is it still like this in Newark today? And has it changed at all?
Oh, no. I mean, it's definitely changed. There are vestigial legacies of so many of these 20th century problems in sexual and gender ideology, for sure. But I think any fair observer would say that Newark has made tremendous progress. Any group on the left that I'm aware of in the North Jersey region is definitely LGBTQ affirmative to different levels of sort of commitment and fervor. But, I don't think you're going to see much of that old left homophobia. It's just not welcome in left or progressive spaces anymore, for the most part. It's an ongoing struggle. But yeah, even Raz Baraka, who certainly comes out of the left and is certainly not perfect in many ways, but he raises the rainbow flag just like Cory Booker did. And it would be a little, I think people would be shocked if he didn't in this era. So that's progress to some extent.
Peter, in your chapter, you write, grab the microphone. I think it's on. Yeah. Okay. Peter, in your chapter, you write about the early queer history of Newark, which is defined as the 1870s until the 1940s. Can you explain some of the complexities and difficulties in doing this type of research for that time period? What were your main sources?
So I should say that I took a chance back in the early 90s, mid 90s. I was still in graduate school then, and I was taking a course on the social gospel, believe it or not. And I was assigned to read How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. And simultaneous to that, I was reading George Chauncey's Gay New York and Lucy Sant, who was Luke Sant's then book on sexuality called Low Life. And I noticed the place that they got most of their information from were vice records from people who had been arrested. So one of the big problems I encountered was visibility. There were no gay memoirs, none of the things that we have available to us today. So I came here to the Newark Public Library, went into the New Jersey room, and asked Charles Cummings, told him what I wanted to do. I wondered if there were any detective logs or anything, and sure enough, there were. So I sat for quite a number of months going through these logs and kind of uncovering what were the circumstances by which people were being arrested. And many of them suggested that there was loads of LGBTQ life going on in Newark then, in the same way that it was the generation that I grew up. I came of age in Newark in the 1960s and 70s. So there was a lot of the tension between the left and these related issues and stuff like that. So I took what I had. I wrote a paper for this class. The professor reminded me I was not a historian. So in stepped Tim, who is, and Tim suggested that we take the paper I had written, which I did get an A for, even though I wasn't a historian, and work it into a chapter. So, but I still think there is a challenge trying to find out more information than just, I consider what I did scratching the surface. And as it turns out, the sources that I use are no longer here in the library. They have been moved, I understand, to the Newark Historical Society or some other archive somewhere. So,
have you ever thought about going back further than 1870? And how would you approach that if you did?
Well, that's probably one of the really difficult things. I actually would have to give that some thought. I don't think I'd know where to begin. I have certainly read many books about LGBTQ life, even though that's certainly what was not what it was called back in the 17th or 18th century, but there have been quite a few historians and literature scholars who have written books speculating through correspondence. So that might be one avenue to explore. People's journals, if one has access to them. But I think it would really be hard to find more public representations of that for earlier periods.
Thank you. Dominique, your chapter deals with the explicitness or lack thereof regarding discussion of sex itself in LGBTQ oral histories. Your research has shown that women, particularly Black queer women, seem to feel particularly inhibited discussing sexual behavior and practices. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Why that might be?
Yeah, sure. So a part of what I talk about in the chapter is that there are many layers, particularly when it comes to marginalized people. And so for Black queer women especially, there is a much longer history of pathologization of their sexuality in a way that has made it so that there's a term called the culture of disassemblance and a practice of silence in which Black women don't talk about their sexuality very much because it has been pathologized through slavery and through images like the Hottentot Venus. If you don't know who that is, her name is Sarah or Sardije Bartman, and she was a South African woman in the 19th century, and she was put on exhibit for about 4 years of her life because of her large buttocks, because of her other sexual organs, her breasts and things like that. And she was on display in Europe for 4 years, like I said. And then after she passed, they made a cast of her body. All of this is in one of the footnotes in my chapter, by the way. It couldn't be in the chapter, but I needed her story to also be in the chapter. So it's in a footnote. But they made a cast of her body and her parts, and that was on display until the 70s, and that was taken down, and then it reemerged again in the 80s. And so her body and her parts were not actually put to rest until 2002. And so when you have this very explicit and very visceral way of looking at sexual bodies, particularly, like I said, of Black women, then it's very difficult to talk about it in ways that are about pleasure and not about that trauma, which is what a lot of Black queer women talk about. And I also found that, especially when you're thinking about oral history and queer history, it's not the same, obviously, but it's still a pathologization of a sexuality, of a deviant sexuality. So when you have Blackness and queerness overlapping and gender of women, it makes it very difficult for queer women or Black women or all of the above to talk about the pleasures of their sexuality or to talk about their sexuality at all. And so you find this silence happening in oral history in particular.
So there are some people who will say, well, why do we need to talk about sex explicitly? But you make a very good argument in your piece about why that's important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I'll say I got the inspiration from this piece because I'm a PhD student now in American Studies at Rutgers, and I was taking a seminar course. I honestly don't remember what course it was, but we had an assigned reading for Bodies of Evidence, which is an oral history book. And in it, there was a chapter, which I also talk about in my chapter, where these two presumably white women were being interviewed by the authors, and they were talking very explicitly about the sexual practices and the sexual cultures. And particularly, they were revealing through their discussion of digital and or oral sex, how layers of class and gender manifested in those cultural practices. And so I had a wonder of like how that might occur with Black queer people, Black queer women in particular, how they might talk about gender and class through their expressions of sexuality and through their sexual practices and through discussion of it. And I also thought about that because you see, even in the Queer Oral History Archive, a lot of gay men, particularly white men, much more open about talking about things like cruising. And so we know a lot about the cultural history of cruising because people were open enough to talk about it, and also because historians were brave enough to ask about it. So I think that if we are able to talk about things like sex in a way that is not pathologized and it is not taboo, it can give us a lot of knowledge production, and it can also really break down some of these stigmas around deviant sexualities that are placed upon bodies that are queer and or Black.
So Aaron, you didn't author an essay in the book, but it opens with your poem, the poem you read here tonight, and you were quoted and paraphrased a number of times in the when quotes come from the oral history that you gave. So what does a book like this mean to you, and how do you think it will help an understanding of queer Newark history?
Okay, first and foremost, when I was younger, the poem is actually about, I received a death sentence when HIV and AIDS hit Newark. We lost a lot of people. People were dying. I was 20. I'm now 63, 43 years later. Survived, still moving strong. And that's because of people in Newark, I'm going to just say the gay populace. We kind of united with one another. I met Peter through Project Fire, which was a intervention program to deal with the ballroom community, because back then a lot of our community was devastated. I'll say anywhere from 10 to 20 was dying a week. I thought I was one of them. I wouldn't even tell my moms about it, but I was supported by people like James Creedle, my mentor, Don Ransom. When I say to you, I gave Don Ransom as a young person, I gave that man hell, but he still said, I'm going to teach you how to advocate anyway. I'm going to teach you all what you need to know to take care of yourself in the community. And the poem itself is a testament. I'm still here. And I'm meeting new people all the time and being encouraged when others would condemn me. Meeting the oral history staff, each one of them, from Christina to Whit to Christine, Naomi, they encouraged me because I was really at a point where I was just like, I was tired. I didn't want to be here. So I keep going, primarily because young people should not have to feel unsafe in this world because your sexuality or your practices is different. And even with the LGBTQ community center, I was there when Zakia Gunn was killed. We don't talk about it, nobody really asks about it, but she was also part of Project Fire when she was a little girl, was her aunt, well back then it was her uncle, but her aunt actually brought her there and created another program. They was doing drill teams when we was at El Club de Barrio in the school. And Zakia Gunn was one of the people that was trying, she was making a difference, coming to the practices. So when everybody was making this big deal about her dying, but the only one to really step up was the LGBTQ Center. They were to create a safe space for all young people, anybody who wanted to have a safe space to come and be themselves. That's where it started at. And then other people started coming, I would say, from out of state. They weren't here, but the people who were here were trying to make a difference, and it's definitely needed. And you have a lot of programs today, but unfortunately, the stigma of being HIV positive is still out there. And I'm saying this because I just got a call from a young person who was part of the ballroom community, passed away. He worked, his mother trying to get services for him to bury her son. That hit me, it became personal. So I stay involved because I know what it felt like. And nobody should go through that. Nobody should have to. And to have an outlet like the LGBTQ Center, Project Wow, the different programs, it means a lot for me and for the kids to have somewhere someone they can go to, because a lot of them are suffering and in silence, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
So I have some kind of general questions about the book. I'm going to probably direct these mostly to Whit, but anyone can answer them. First of all, can you explain the genesis of the book, for this book? Where did the idea come from?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, like folks have already alluded to, including Christina. I mean, the Queer Newark Oral History Project at Rutgers Newark, which has been running for what, 13 years now? My God, quite a while. You know, it was just such a rich and generative body of archival material we were generating. You know, aside from the sort of emotionally compelling qualities of it and the sort of political importance of it, just strictly as an historian, you know, I mean, I recognize this is a goldmine of really important stories that does tell a somewhat different narrative. You know, I mean, in Newark, you know, queer activism has been led by working class, often primarily Black, you know, queer people, which differs from the kind of white dominated, you know, more moneyed infrastructure of cities with more money. You know, New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, they look different. Not that they lack queer people of color by any means, but that the money flows to the more visible sector, which tends to be the more affluent and more white sectors of the community. And so, I mean, it seemed like Newark had an important story that deserved to be told. And I will say, you know, folks in the project, we've really been focused on community-based history, right? I mean, on public events like this, on you know, the podcast that Kristen pioneered, on different kinds of programming. And I'm probably the most kind of old school, traditional methodological person in the group. You know, I was like, well, an academic book. It's just those are the terms I think in. You know, I mean, that's where my skill set is. And so that's kind of where it shook out. You know, why I wound up as the editor of the book, because other people are doing, you know, really great other exciting work that probably reaches a broader public in some ways. But, you know, I thought it was important to do a scholarly book, an accessible one. You know, it's not, for folks who haven't looked at it yet, it's not, you know, it's not some dense theoretical jargon manifesto. Don't worry, it is very, very readable. But it's also deliberately an intervention, you know, into an historiographical narrative that doesn't center cities like Newark. You know, when you look at LGBTQ community studies in America, you know, you don't see Cleveland and Gary and Baltimore and Detroit, you know, or Newark. And so I think it pushes back against that tendency to sort of erase cities that are less visibly queer because they're less, you know, wealthily queer. So anyway, yeah, that was kind of my take. I don't know if other folks have a different kind of spin on it.
For me, I appreciated all aspects of it, even to the point I'm currently the person at the LGBTQ Center. During COVID, you know, we was all isolated, didn't have nothing to do, but they had a couple of interesting training programs going around. I end up doing a podcast training through WBGO. Met some absolutely fabulous people. So, you know, well, anybody that knows me, I end up talking to people, and I continue to talk to people. And I asked the young lady who was the facilitator of the class, well, why don't you come to this LGBTQ Center and do a podcast training? Our podcast training is in full effect. They had their first class last week. Their first class in person will be tomorrow, Thursday evening at the LGBTQ Community Center. And I'm so ecstatic about it because it's going to lead up to other things for these young people to tell their stories, similar to what Queer Oral History is doing. And throughout Newark, it's called 5 Ward Media. Britt Harley started her own cohort, and she got 5 different initiatives going on, but she kept minds that I wanted here, and she took it on. So I'm really appreciative. She made it happen. So I'm just ecstatic, and it is needed because these young kids, there's a whole lot of them. They are dealing with I thought I was dealing with crazy stuff. They're dealing with a whole lot of stuff. They're dealing with gang violence. They're dealing with being in one part of the city to the point that they can't go into another part, and they didn't do nothing. These people are just trying to travel. So they have to be mindful of that. And this, believe me, it's a struggle for them.
So you mentioned the LGBTQ community. So what's the address of that? It's on Market Street, right?
Market Street, second floor. We are now officially on the marquee. Just hit the bell, the top button, and I will answer to buzz you in. Yes, I will.
So Whit, you mentioned that most books about LGBTQ life don't focus on cities like Newark that are dominated by working class people of color. You mentioned that you think it's more of a matter of money and where the money goes. Is there anything else at play there?
Oh, sure. I mean, money and racism. I mean, the two go hand in hand, obviously. Definitely that. And then, beyond that, I think, a certain, a certain just kind of fixed narrative of where queer life resides in America, even within the more familiar cities, right? It's always West Hollywood in LA rather than, East LA, for instance, or, the gayborhood in Philly instead of West Philly. So, I mean, yeah, I don't want to overstate the case. My fellow historians who are doing LGBTQ history do remarkable, fantastic, sophisticated work. So, I mean, I'm speaking at a very aerial level here, but I do think it's true that, yeah, I mean, those factors converge on places like Newark. Basically, racism and poverty render, not just queer life, but Newark life invisible to a large extent.
So moving on more about the book, how were the contributors chosen and why were certain topics chosen?
Again, I don't want to talk more than everybody else. I mean, if everybody else wants to jump in on this, I mean, Peter, you were a pioneer on this and you kind of laid the groundwork for some of it. And I think that played an important role. It was thrilling to take this paper that Peter had written in the 90s and bring it back to life, So I think thinking like that, and I mean, Dominique had been in the grad seminar where her chapter began as a seminar paper, right? And so just kind of being aware of all of that and seeing there's this critical mass of stuff out there already that one can draw on. I mean, Yamil Avivi, who wrote the chapter on Latinx immigrants in the Ironbound, he had published 2 articles on queer Brazilians several years ago based on ethnography that he had done in, I think, 2009. And so I reached out to him and he was excited to go back and re-interview the Brazilian immigrant men that he had interviewed in 2009, again in 2019. I don't know. I mean, nobody's done work like that. I was just thrilling to get that. And I mean, every chapter has a backstory like that. Leilani Dowell, who writes about the New Jersey 4 or New Jersey 7, the young Black lesbians who were sort of charged with these hyper punitive gang charges in New York for fighting off a street harasser, but who came from Newark. She had written a dissertation at CUNY, and that put her in our orbit, of the Queer Newark Oral History Project. And I was super psyched for her to take one of her dissertation chapters and turn it into a book chapter. So yeah, I mean, every one of the chapters has that kind of story of just sort of being aware of people doing this work already. And so just being like, hey, please bring that, into this collection.
So it's mentioned in the introduction that this book is, that it's hoped that this book will lead to other scholarship. Can any of you can answer this? What other types of work would you like to see this lead to?
I really would like to see more work on queer Black sexuality. And in particular, there's a book called Longing to Tell by Trisha Rose that is an oral history of Black women. And she intentionally takes off all markers of sexuality so that it reads more fluidly. And it's pretty much the most comprehensive oral history of Black femme sexuality to date. And that was in 2004. I would really love to see more people doing oral histories about queer women and their sexuality and Black women and their sexuality in general, so that something like that could come out of it, out of different cities, or something more all-encompassing like Trisha Rose's book.
Anyone else? Do either of you?
One of the areas that I'm greatly interested in, which is how I came to do so much field work in Newark back mostly in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, was about people's spiritual and religious lives, particularly people my generation of gay men. We were told God and gay don't go together. You have to pick either one or the other. And I thought, well, I'm gay and I have a spiritual life. I can't be the only person. So a lot of the work I did was interviewing particularly members of the houses, the ballroom community in Newark, and their religious lives, because if any group of human beings was demonized as being so far away from God, unfortunately, it is that community. And I would like to see more of how people who are marginalized by institutional religion make their spiritual way in the world, and how they bring the spiritual dimension of being human into their queer lives, and what is the relationship between spirituality and the pleasure of sex, for example, as opposed to we must always be battling, the spirit must always be battling against the flesh. How about the spirit in the flesh, right? That is something I would really like to be able, if I had the time and the resources, to do more, but hopefully the younger generations of scholars and ethnographers and oral historians might be willing to do that kind of work.
In the chapter about the walking tours, it's pointed out that there was an effort in designing the walking tours to not focus only on acts of violence for fear that it will feed into Newark's reputation as a crime-ridden, dysfunctional city. Was the book approached with the same mindset?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, definitely, absolutely. Even down to the subtitle, right? Stories of resistance, love, and community. And I really owe that to Kim, went to Rutgers University Press, who told me, don't sound like some out of touch ivory tower academic, give it a subtitle that people want to read. And I was like, I don't know, is that too cheesy? And I thought it kind of was at first. And I really have come around. I mean, it's a book that is absolutely intended to celebrate Newark's history without whitewashing it. I mean, it's a history that, is complicated and has been, marked by tragedy, by disinvestment, by racism, by other forms of structural inequality, homophobia. I mean, everybody in this room knows that, though, at some level or other, right? And so, I mean, I think it's a book that's intended to push against that narrative by also celebrating the resistance and the sort of flowering of community in the face of all of that. I mean, understanding the tragic and oppressive and traumatic side of that history makes you appreciate the community even more, like just knowing what Peter and Aaron went through as young men, and what they've done with that, what they've cultivated. I mean, it's humbling, it's inspiring. And so yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's 100% intended to push back against the kind of reductive and caricatured versions of Newark that, circulated for so many years in the mainstream press, right? I mean, that was outside of Newark. I mean, that Newark became a metonym for urban decay in America, right? Very unfairly, but that is, the kind of cultural meaning that it carried at the national level. And so yeah, I mean, I do hope it intervenes in that and shows that, Newark has a much more rich and interesting history, frankly.
So now I have some questions just about general queer life in Newark. So first of all, what are some of the challenges facing LGBTQ plus people in Newark today? Anyone?
Okay, I wanted to chime in after Peter. But I'm gonna say, as a spiritual person and religious person, coming up, being told that you were an abomination, you don't deserve to live, and that bothered me. And I need to say also, I became a suicide. I committed suicide my first time away from home because the way these people treated me, my first time away from my mother, my father, my family, I had no support. But I'll say this, I went to some church on another campus, and I was told spiritually that you need to go home. There's a church coming that will be for you and people like you. And that's when I met Unity Fellowship Church. At the time, it was LIT. Today is Unity Fellowship Church Newark, under the leadership of Bishop-elect Kevin E. Taylor. Our other pastor, Jerry Lee, just retired, but she's in the room somewhere. And Minister Beatrice is in the back. but it's a whole different thing today. We are trying to help educate our young people. Also at the LGBTQ Center, we did our first intergenerational luncheon for the different generations can actually share information and educate one another. And for the first one, it actually went well, 22 people, young and old, middle. And the young people who were non-binary were educating a lot of us older people who had no clue. And it really went well, the exchange and everything. And my goal for that is to be ongoing because they need to know. We all need to know to educate one another because I'm still in awe of the different terminology, the different pronouns. And a lot of the kids that I interact with, they call me Auntie Una. My other name is Una, Mother of the House of Divine. So yeah, I'm Auntie Una. You'll see on some flyers, call Auntie Una, and I'll let them in, whatever the particulars are. And I don't mind working with the young people. The young people really want to be part of, but a lot of people just kick them to the side, and that isn't the way to do it. But I don't know how much longer I can do it, but I'm going to do as long as God gives me the energy and the strength till I can find me somebody that can do the same thing. Anyone else?
So I think one of the big challenges, not only to the queer community in Newark, but queer communities everywhere, is what is going on in the country right now. The over 2,700 and something anti-trans, anti-LGBT laws that have been passed in various states. The backlash on the part of the religious right, for example, these are big threats. They may seem like not very evident or obvious in a flourishing community here in the Newark Public Library with the LGBTQ Center on the floor beneath this. But that's really one of the biggest challenges, and we need to find ways to push back and resist that rather than crawling into our little corners and just being quiet.
Well, I mean, I'm not from Newark, so I don't know a lot about the queer community in Newark. What I will say is that being not from here, I really only had envisions of Newark from like media and things. So it was very this idea of this like violent city. And one thing that Queer Newark, the Oral History Project in general, but I also think the book really celebrates, as Whit said, is that when I came to the Oral History Project as an MA student in the history department, I really was reading all of these stories about the city that, like I said, I'd never been to. I'm from Southern California, so I had no conception of Newark, New Jersey outside of literally The Sopranos. So the Oral History Archive really gave me a much more beautiful and much deeper history of this city. And it really, as much as I could see the violence, obviously hearing Sakia's story, for instance, which I had heard briefly, but I didn't actually like have a conception of that meaning until I came here and I read and listened to and really heard from the people of this city, not only the violence that they experienced, but the ways that they resisted and pushed back from that. And it really, I see Newark through that lens now, and it's a much more beautiful picture.
So one of the chapters compares news coverage of the death of Sakia Gunn with coverage of the death of Matthew Shepard just a few years earlier. The author points out that there was considerably more coverage of the death of Shepard, a white gay male who died in Wyoming, than there was of Gunn, a black lesbian who was murdered in downtown Newark. How has something like this changed?
Has it?
No, how does something?
No, has it?
No, it has.
Right. Yeah. I think just say once again, being willing, and I know it takes a lot of courage to be visible and to be outspoken, and as much as we can do that, and each of us must find a way to do that in our individual lives, either by joining our forces with others, whether other queer people or our allies, or doing it in our own individual way as best we can. but silence does equal death, whether it was back in the 1980s and when HIV first appeared on the scene, or now in 2024. Our silence will equal our death because they want to destroy us, whoever they are.
I'm going to chime in on that particular piece because even though Zakia Gunn, unfortunately, her situation brought light to what happens in the city of Newark, but it really didn't show that much light because it's a bunch of young LGBTQ people who have been murdered throughout this city. It's a whole lot, and there was a lot of gay men killed throughout this city. Back in my days on the stroll, there was many trans women who were killed. Nobody talked about it. Nobody even mentioned it. Butch Queens, young, killed because they slept with somebody and they were so concerned the person who they slept with didn't want to be outed. But, you know, the more aggressive person, the bigger person, took advantage and killed that younger person. Nobody mentioned those many deaths. And when I say it's quite a few, not to mention even some that's going on right now that they're not even talking about, with a young trans woman and a young gay man the bodies was found in Weekway Park recently. So it's still going on because DL boys or DL people still like to mess around, but just don't want to be exposed. It's going on. A lot of that is just about being accepted. If everybody would just accept the person for who they are sexuality-wise and say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. A lot of people smile in our faces and really do harm behind our backs. But I have learned to be very observant as an older person. I can tell when somebody don't care for me, and I'm okay with that. But I don't really keep my back towards them because that person will be the one to take you out that you think you're comfortable with.
So one of the chapters in the book deals with policing and LGBTQ people in Newark. Points out the fraught situation with queer people of color, people in two marginalized communities, both of which have a troubled history with the police. Can someone comment on that a little bit and how that's changed at all? If it has changed, or can it be changed?
I'm gonna take that one. We had LGBTQ liaison up until last year last year. I haven't heard anything about nobody succeeding this person or, to get, still keep us abreast if we're having problems within our community. Who can we send somebody to get some results? I haven't received a call nor information or who's the replacement or anything. And even the person who was originally, he doesn't answer his phone anymore.
Yeah, well, I can add to that. There's a chapter in the book about young queer people of color in Newark and their interactions with and perceptions of the Newark Police Department, written by Danielle Shields, a grad student in criminal justice at Rutgers Newark. And it's a very damning portrait of the Newark Police Department, which was, its anti-gay and anti-trans practices were mentioned in the report that led to the federal consent decree years ago. And based on the evidence from a number of sample groups with firsthand testimony that Shields and her co-author Kars Ramos took, young people in Newark, young queer people of color, do not trust the Newark Police Department. And the chapter in the book, it's full of vivid or just horrifying anecdotes. And I mean, their concluding line of the chapter is, from this perspective of young queer people of color and their relationship with the Newark Police Department, Newark represents a modern day, slow motion, long-standing perpetration of the same bigotry, homophobia, and transphobia that precipitated and ultimately unleashed the fury of the rioters present at the Stonewall Inn. That's pretty damning prose from social scientists. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a vivid chapter, and it should be an upsetting chapter to read because, you know, even under Mayor Baraka, you know, the mayor endorsed so-called quality of life policing sweeps of downtown Newark, which comes straight out of broken windows policing from the 1980s, which were a racist and classist mechanism that people like Rudy Giuliani celebrated. And it was really frustrating to me as a Newarker to see Mayor Baraka, who, you know, is very commendable on other fronts in calling for a civilian review board of the police, but to capitulate to that developer-oriented form of policing that sweeps up young people into the criminal justice system and also did sex worker raids, you know, criminalizing people for sex work and then getting them into the criminal justice system, getting them records, publicizing their names and photos. And so, yeah, I mean, I personally think as a police and prison abolitionist that this is an ongoing struggle, that, you know, we're obviously nowhere near that utopian horizon right now, but, you know, we certainly need to be pushing back against, you know, the policing that serves the interests of capital rather than people, which I think is how it works in Newark.
I have nothing nice to say about cops, so I'm going to say nothing.
So are things better for queer people in Newark than they were 20 years ago or 10 years ago? And how could they be better? Open-ended question.
Again, as we're doing this intergenerational lunching, it's to create an ongoing dialogue between our community, you know, because we're very diverse, young, culturally different, but for my personal purposes is to create the safe space. Come and talk. Once you have an open dialogue ongoing, you can work through some things and you can make some things happen. For one, try to create some unification between our community as a whole. That's the first thing, and just keep doing it, because once people get comfortable enough talking with one another about the different problems that each and everyone is dealing with, eventually they have no choice but to, I have to rely on you. I have to rely on you. I have to rely on you. And at the same time, you're educating those who would know nothing about what's going on. And hopefully that will build the bridge to a better understanding, and we'll get to that unification piece.
I would say one of the ways that things are definitely better is the very fact that we are sitting here having this event today. That was certainly not something that I could have envisioned happening in Newark 20 years ago, certainly not 30 years ago or 40 years ago. The fact that there's an LGBTQ center in Newark, that there is Newark Pride, none of those existed. I don't think we could even imagine those things back in the 1970s and 80s. Certainly not even in the 90s, right? So that doesn't mean that there isn't still a lot more work to do. There is, but there's also the reality, at least from where I sit, literally and figuratively, things are definitely better than when I was a queer kid growing up in Newark, when I had to maneuver how I was going to get to from one place to the other without somebody waiting or some group of people waiting to beat me up or thwart my every intention to just live and thrive. So there's definitely improvement in that regard.
And, you know, we are the first entity to have the LGBTQ Film Festival, which is in April next month. So yeah, that part is definitely well to be established. And also, I have to say this, I love my executive director because she never declined when I'm trying to create something new to bring people into the doors. And I just, we're open to people coming in and at least come in the door. That don't be talking about what y'all don't have. Come in the door and sit at the table and let's talk about what we can make. And a lot of people think, we just have all these programs going on. I'm like, but you don't come to the door. You ain't coming to the building, and the doors is open. And when I say it's so much that Beatrice have been working on to keep the doors open and to where you can at least ring the bell and come in where we're at. So, that says a lot. We didn't have that before. Not when Project was. It's a wrap. So that's a good thing.
But we still had fun.
I'll just add one thing. I mean, part of your question, Tom, was how can things improve, right? I mean, one theme that I do think comes through in the chapters of the book is that material resources are crucial. People's hearts and minds matter. It's important to fight homophobia and transphobia, but safe spaces cost money. They don't exist in a netherworld that's divorced from political economy. And I think, if you look at the book, gentrification is framed by multiple chapters as a queer issue because it displaces queer spaces. And you see that in the LGBT Community Center, where when I was on the board of directors along with Beatrice and Denise and others, we got displaced. Like the developer L&M came and bought the whole building on Halsey Street, kicked us out, and has done nothing with it. That building is still sitting there. I think it's a perfect example of how gentrification affects communities that are disproportionately susceptible to that kind of economic colonization, of which queer Newark spaces are one. And if you look downtown Newark, the African American Office of Gay Concerns, AAOGC, they've been really struggling financially lately. They need money. It's like it's great to have visibility and all of those things. I'm not suggesting those don't matter, but the sheer political economy of financial resources, I think, is absolutely crucial. And so many political figures like to raise a rainbow flag and say something nice and not commit any money or resources toward queer issues. And I think that deserves a lot of calling out and pushing back because this community does need money in Newark. And that's just what I think worth saying out loud and worth being very aware of when we think about what queer politics look like.
So did anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions from the audience. Okay, so we're going to pass the microphone around. Anybody have any questions?
Hi, my name is Chi Chima, and I basically had a question for Aaron that kind of touched off you had just said about how safe spaces cost money. Currently, I am a volunteer at the Project T/Project Wow Center on 45 Commerce, and one of the discussions that we had during the Trans Advisory Board meeting, one of our trans community members had said that, especially in terms of funding and how they're allowed to decorate the space because they are funded by NJCRI through a grant program and multiple grant programs every year. We were just talking about how safe spaces cost money, but we know that what we had ended up discussing is a lot of the money that they are able to get in their yearly grants, a lot of the statistics that they're looking at is mostly how many people can they pull in for HIV testing. And they aren't really given a lot of notice on their other kind of work, especially in helping other trans community members, not only Newark community members, but immigrants. And NJCRI almost only recognizes their HIV testing members, which causes them, because there's so many centers who are doing thing of grants that are based off of that providing testing to the community, which is vital, yes. But I think the people who are doing this work need to be recognized for more things and given more resources to push towards there rather than for purely just testing. How would you say that we can work on getting our community leaders, especially in those spaces who are working there, to get the recognition that they deserve with the backing of the resources and the money?
Okay. Okay, for me, I also sit on Project T's Community Advisory Board. And as I told them last week, the things in the conversation was a bit much for me because when it comes to programming and particular programming itself, I don't know what the particulars are of the grant because I didn't read the particular, like that side piece. It's been a long time. I can't even think of the part. But I will say this: the conversation that they were having at that meeting went a bit outside because we was got with another group that basically was doing the same thing, was trying to start another CBO nonprofit within a nonprofit. That's a conflict of interest, and I told them, leave that alone. You just need to go ask the whoever your particulars are or hierarchy at NJCRI and tell them that you need a little bit more funding and things of that nature. I just didn't want to get into the particulars because it's too much of a conflict for me personally. And I still work with them in actually different things that we're doing. We have actually collabed on resume writing, letting them come in and have a safe space to do mock interviews, specifically when we was downstairs in the library. We did so much with them and brought different resources in to help them and their clients, and not to mention a big old job fair next door. Did they tell you how many people showed? Correct. And when I say they had the whole space, and a lot of times it's an unfortunate, they have our trans community, young people have been given so much that they think that they're entitled to. They wanted to come to their door. Child, you got to come to the job fair. And they were hiring people on the spot, regardless of their background, if they've been locked up, whatever. They were being hired on the spot. And it was only 5 people, if that. And that, and a lot of the stuff that, and I'm saying this because Imani is my niece, Imani has stepped out of her comfort zone and did a lot of crazy things to make things accessible for for the community. The community got to come out. They have to support the program that is created. And this is the first program of its kind for, transgender, non-binary, what's the rest of it? But it's the first program of its kind in the nation. So when I say they have stepped out of their comfort zone to do things to bring people in, if it's not incentivized, they don't get nobody. And everything, everything can't be incentivized. Then you want this and you want that. You have to be part of the process. You can't stand across the street and complain about what's not happening. You have to be at the table. You have to come to the table. Even if you may not like the person, you may not agree with the person, come to the table anyway. Your voice is gonna eventually make a difference, and that's what it's about. Us sharing different ideas. I don't always have to like you, but I gotta respect you for what you're doing and what you're bringing to the table to keep you encouraged and hopefully encourage other people that we could build a better program that's better for our community.
And Aaron, can I just add very briefly? I mean, also, we shouldn't need grants for HIV and trans healthcare. They should be covered under a single payer universal healthcare system. And so shame on any New Jersey politician who does not support Medicare for all, of which there are many. Just since climbing on a soapbox since I'm here.
Yes, that was perfect. First, I want to thank you all for being here. To the 2 gentlemen to my left, and for this book, all of you, because in my family, I have a lot of gay relatives. My daughter came out after high school. She's a lesbian. And my brother died when AIDS first came out. He was one of the first to die. So it is a big part of my life and my family. And because many of them have passed, I can't talk to them and ask them and get that oral history from them. And so I look forward to buying this book and reading the oral history you all compiled together. But I have two questions. One is for our youth, mainly, teenagers, maybe a little younger, who come out to their parents and are put out of their homes. Does Newark have a safe space for them? Because they then are homeless. Is there a place for them to come and stay?
Covenant House is basically I would say, the most safest space for them in Newark. And I say this because a lot of the young people that I have met and have gone through that process, I see a better outcome with them going through the Covenant House. And they kind of, if they go through the proper channels, they kind of transition them into the proper, like to the next step of getting sustainable housing. So that's the one I would suggest.
Okay, I know they have very limited rooms there or beds.
But
Covenant House?
Covenant House is actually kind of worldwide.
Yeah, but the one in Newark. I think there's only like
But
20.
they all,
Yeah, I think it's about 20.
but it's also Rain House in Newark Y is actually in collaboration. And I don't know what they broke ground a couple of years ago or a year ago. I don't know when their facility is going to be finished or started.
Okay, great. So they'll be taking younger people.
Yeah.
That's awesome to know. The second question is also for you two. Did you find it necessary, either in your younger years or even when you were still with your parents, to pretend that you weren't gay? And at what point did you just say, forget it? I just got to be me.
Well, I'm laughing because I think it was probably obvious from pretty early on. I was in the habit as a young child of twirling around in my mother's dresses every chance I got. So my very Italian-American straight family was a little perplexed by that. And then much later in life, around the age of, I had a real struggle coming out of the closet, and much of it was because of religion. So my pattern was come out of the closet, go to all the clubs, go to Gay Activist Alliance in New York City, and then freak out and come home and enter a Catholic monastery where I was going to give my life to God for all eternity until my hormones raced again, and then I was out. So somewhere around 18 or 19, by that point, my father was long deceased. I did tell my mother, who pretty much said, oh, I've known that all along, and that's fine. I still love you, but don't ever mention it to me again. And so, over the years, that got better. My mother's been dead for about 25 years or so, or 24 years now. So it was definitely rough. And it took me a long time to even feel comfortable in my own skin, so to speak. And now I'd say I'm fairly comfortable. I still have moments where I have to stop and think where I am and what I can say and what I can do and what I should say or shouldn't say. But for the most part, I'm pretty sure I'm not a Black man, though I feel great solidarity with Black men, straight or gay, so, and everything in between.
First, oh yes, when I came out, I had to do what is called self-acceptance, and my self-acceptance was a suicide attempt. And when I woke up elsewhere, me and God had a little chat, and I realized then I was meant to be here. And when I did, I had that's a good. When I came out, I ended up joining this ministry on another campus. This was during the Jim Brown era. Is that, am I saying that right? Jim Brown? My mother, the one who was, my mother thought I joined an occult and begged me to come home. Yes. So I was told to come home. But and when I came home, people was doing crazy stuff, and I was like, oh my God. There was people telling other people's story before they could even come out to their families. And I just said, oh, I gotta tell my mother. Because I said, when them people tell her before I do, I'm in trouble. And actually, it started out because I was angry because somebody did tell my mother. And when they told my mother, I was so angry, I got drunk at the bar. And I was drunk. And I got stabbed that night in my face. I had to go, I called the bar, a friend of mine. This homeless man said, how can I help you? I gave him the quarter to call the bar. I said, call my friend, Carnell, he works at the bar. And the whole bar, Murphy's, came around to where I was at to make sure I was all right. And Carnell went with me to the hospital. And he said, I gotta call your mother. I said, don't call my mother. And he called my mother and she came near. She was like, are you all right? I said, yeah. But I eventually had to, tell her. And she said, really? It was like, you made a big fuss out of this. My mother accepted me. My father accepted me. Actually, the whole family did. I did have to beat up my sisters and brothers for a little bit. But overall, I was accepted in my family, in my community. And I come up realizing I wasn't the only one. There was like 5 friends of mine, and we on a porch coming out to one another. And ever since then, we never had a problem in the community that we lived in North Newark. Nobody, if you was in North Newark, just because you were gay, no, nobody harmed you. There was no harm, and everybody looked out for us.
Hello, my name's Titi, and my question is actually mainly for Peter, but for anyone who's interested in answering. And I'm mainly thinking about spirituality and religiosity with queerness. And I know you described it earlier, like the idea of the spirit battling the flesh, which I have heard of and have myself, dabbled in. And I also have watched a lot of like videos online and discourse around sort of the struggle being in the action of homosexuality, or even the battle being beyond the sexuality itself, but other things that you're doing in your life. And I guess my question is, what is your opinion on that rhetoric and the complicated politics of reading the Bible or other religious texts as homophobic and sexist?
Wow. So I think I can only speak from my own personal experience in that regard. So I think, and I will tell you, I have pretty much tried and converted to almost every religion you can think of, because I have been a lifelong seeker. And I think the most difficult but necessary lesson I had to learn is that I have to be guided by my own spirit. I have to trust that. Scriptures are interesting things, but I also know that so many texts. There are multiple layers and levels of interpretation to all of those scriptures. And I've had to learn when I do draw upon them to trust my own inner lights in terms of interpreting what those things mean. I am very certain that those things, particularly in the Bible, in both the Jewish Torah or Old Testament and the New Testament, whatever it is that they're talking about there is not homosexuality as we know and understand it today. So I think really ultimately the best solution, at least for me, is to trust that I have the divine presence within me, whatever that means. And that takes many shapes and forms depending on what's going on in my life. But that's my religious authority, not some minister or some bishop or some priest or whatever the case may be.
So I have a question. I brought my history of Newark students here tonight. So I was wondering if you all could speak to like aspects of Newark LGBTQ history that you lived through. Like for instance, Aaron, if you could talk about like being a house mother, like what is that like? Or experiencing the ballroom community, like Peter, being a part of Rage or other consciousness raising groups in Newark. And Dominique, like you're not from here, but like do you have a favorite, part of this history that you've learned about or an oral history that you found like really interesting in the archive?
For me, our ballroom time, well, my ballroom time, I had no real intentions on, how you say, becoming an icon, legend, any of that. We just wanted to take, a group of us wanted to take a lot of those kids who were gay, but they were still kind of ostracized from their own community. When I say I took actual kids that they would call knots, they weren't worthy, and made them into tens, made them into icons. One of my daughters, she became the mother of the house of Sinclair. And me and her, I showed up at a ball. I hadn't walked in a while. And I just showed up at the latex ball, got behind her, and hit the runway. The whole ballroom went up because they knew that this was my ex-daughter. And it was so much fun and whatnot. But then I got sat down. I got my tens, but I got sat down. That's what it was about. We was about having fun and building camaraderie. It didn't matter what house you was in. We was all family back then. We didn't go through a lot of the stuff that these kids go through today. We were, we looked out after one another. And if you were, say, in another house getting ready for a ball, and I look at you and one of my kids, I said, child, go help her. She got it. Even though you're competition, we wasn't letting you go out there half-assed. We made sure you was done right, so it'd be a nice, friendly, competition, and a lot of that occurred. And I'm gonna give one thing. I'm still trying to get this daggone clip. I've been calling everybody at the Jordan Ball. See, y'all know her as what's her name? She was on Pose.
MJ Broad.
No. Dominique. Back then, her name was Tyra. Miss Tyra walked against Miss Coco Chrissia LaBelle at the Jordan Ball at the Robert Treat. When I say to you, that was an iconic, historic moment. She sat down Andre Mizrahi, she sat down Aura Sinclair and David Sinclair in June. And these are the icons of ballroom. Miss Coco sat all of them down, including Tyra. So that's a moment that I'm still trying to get. And I know somebody got it because this young lady, she's an icon. She's known for Femme Queen performance because she used to battle Miss Yolanda and Allura, which is also from Jersey. and she got a clip of her battling, and that's the same ball that this occurred, but she won't give me the information.
Was it in the 90s?
This is the 90s, right? You was on the door. Well, this is Robert. He was part of the House of Jordan. He's more of the business aspect, but he worked the door at that ball.
Oh, wow. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Kristen, could you just repeat the question again?
Sure.
Sorry.
Like if you could talk a little bit about like aspects of Newark queer history that you've lived through, like maybe being a part of Rage or consciousness raising groups, or I just, there were so many interesting things about your story.
Well, so I can tell you that Rage, which I'm trying to remember now, it was Rutgers Alliance for Gay Education. And we were all very excited about that. But like people have described about the job fair, we have meetings and and this was back in 1971, 1972, and only 2 or 3 people would show up. So then we would just give up and go out dancing, which was, loads of fun. And I would say probably one of the real highlights for me was, when I was by this point in my very late 40s, early 50s, was back in the 90s when I approached the mothers and fathers of the houses about wanting to conduct oral histories and interviews about people's spiritual lives. And a few of them looked at me and said, "Oh, sure, we'd love to have you do that. But there's also something we want you to do for us." And I said, "Okay, I'm happy to do whatever you want." And they said, "You have to walk." So I would show up at various mothers and fathers' apartments and would walk, and then eventually walk in a ball, which I thought was my secret until a few years ago. They did a program here on queer life in Newark, and up on the TV was me voguing down a runway. So that was definitely one of my happier, more joyful moments.
So on the subject of ballroom, for me, again, I'm a big media person. That's why I write about it now. So I saw Paris is Burning a while ago. And then when I was working for the Oral History Project, I listened to Miss Pucci Revlon's oral history, and she talks about it. And what I found really interesting is that she talks about how she doesn't like her inclusion in it. And I thought it really gave an interesting perspective because, again, we see things and we see, especially something like that, where we're just like, oh, this is so amazing. And this is so like spectacular and historical and important. And it is, but it's also to hear from the people themselves, this sort of like tension is really fascinating. And then I also got to interview Erica Harrison, who was the mother of LeJacques when it was here. And so hearing her talk about that experience and just all the clubs and bars on Halsey Street, as someone not from Newark, it really makes my heart hurt that they don't exist anymore. Because just hearing and reading and seeing all of the beauty that these club spaces is really incredible.
And actually, I was going to mention Pucci as well. Pucci Revlon was a Black trans woman here in Newark who I conducted 3 or 4 rounds of long oral history interviews with. And while I was interviewing her, she had already been diagnosed with cancer that was terminal. It didn't mean she was going to die imminently, but it did mean, there was no getting out of this. This was, how she was going to go. And, she knew that, and it made it a very kind of heavy occasion in some ways, but it was just very, very moving and very humbling for me, as a cisgender white guy that, she welcomed into her home and shared her story with me. I think, we both had an understanding that this was going to be an historical document for the archive that we both recognize as valuable. I really treasured my time with Pucci, who was just, warm and funny and kind of catty, but also, very honest about where she was scoring hormones in the 70s, and just such a rich history. And then after she passed, I've got to say, I attended her funeral on MLK Boulevard, and I have to give a shout out to Mr. Aaron Frazier because a lot of her more distant relatives were misgendering her at the podium in their commemoration of her life. And I don't know that they meant this. I don't know that it was deliberately insidious. I think it might have been confused. But Aaron, you probably remember this. You got up to that podium and you just really laid down, very assertively, but without being aggressively. She was a wonderful woman. I remember her, and people took the cue. From then on, everybody recognized and respected her pronouns and her gender as she lived it. And it was a really beautiful and inspiring moment. So I mean, I'm grateful for having known her, and Aaron, I've always been grateful for you for that moment because I thought it was really courageous.
And I must say, Poochie was my sister. She took me to, I've always saw the pool hall where most of the trans would meet up before they hit the stroll. And I had already gotten my little 40-ounce of Old English. And I told Poochie, I said, girl, well, where you going? And, oh, I'm going to the stroll. I said, okay, girl. So I went with her and I saw all these the kids in the thing. And I just enjoyed walking with Poochie and being educated by her, even to the point when I agreed to do drag queen bingo for the center. I was nervous as what, but Poochie made sure she sat her butt in the front and she kept heckling me to get me to be comfortable, even to the point we took a sidebar. She said, if you want a drink, bitch, I got a drink for you. And they made me feel so good because I was nervous. It was my first time doing drag queen bingo, but she made me feel confident enough to do it and do a good job. And we took photos outside, and it's just, I don't have a lot of friends. When I say I can literally count them on one hand, but that was my sister.
So we don't really have any time for any more questions, but I do want to read something that someone posted online. Just a minute. So this is from Jason Chernetzky. He says, I don't have any questions, but I would like y'all to give special thanks to Peter for his scholarship and oral history, as well as Aaron for his oral history. Their work and experiences will be extremely important for future scholars and citizens that want to learn about the impact HIV/AIDS had on queer Newarkers. The comment.
And Tom, can I say that Jason is the author of the chapter in the book on HIV/AIDS in Newark, which was based on his fantastic master's thesis that he wrote in the history department at Rutgers Newark, and then he later did a PhD at Penn. He's just a fantastic scholar, so that really means a lot coming from him.
So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank everybody who came out tonight and everybody at home who's watching. And you can buy books over here. You might want to ask some of the authors of the articles to sign your books for you. They're up right here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.